Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys facts about historic relaxation, and the curious, unhurried ways in which people, long ago, chose to rest. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in the ancient art of relaxation before the internet was even a whisper of an idea. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know. What is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode on prehistoric relaxation. Let us start with storytelling around the fire. Imagine, if you will, a flicker of light in a world without electricity, without lamps, without even candles. Only the steady, unpredictable crackle of firewood as it gave its heat and light. Humans, before 3000 BC, would gather around these fires, not for spectacle, but for survival. And then, slowly, for comfort. It was in these dim circles that stories were told. Tales of hunts, myths of creatures seen and unseen, and simple recountings of who went where, and what they saw. Though the content may seem dramatic, the act itself was deeply soothing. A low voice, steady, repeating details, lulling listeners into a trance-like state. Firelight danced on the walls, shadows stretched and melted. No one asked for suspense, not really. The rhythm of speech was enough. It was not unlike listening to the same bedtime story every night, its predictability bringing comfort. And so, relaxation was found not in the action of the tale, but in the stillness of listening, of words passing like smoke into the night air. What we now know from archaeological evidence is that these oral traditions served as a form of memory, carrying knowledge between generations, but they also shaped the mood of the night. A hunter's tale, told and retold, might soften into a ritualized cadence, the details less important than the quiet drone of language. It soothed children to sleep and gave adults a slow rhythm to settle their breathing by, much as the fire's own crackle kept the night steady and warm. From fire, let us float gently onward to the practice of cave painting. One might imagine this as art with grand purpose, but in truth, it was often repetitive, careful, slow. The ancient human hand pressing pigments of ochre, charcoal, or hematite onto a cool stone surface. Each brush or finger mark was deliberate, and time passed unmeasured. To trace an outline of a bison, or to repeat the image of a hand upon the wall, was a meditative act, one that quieted the restless mind. Painting in flickering firelight, in the silence of a cavern, was less about beauty and more about continuity. Line by line, image by image, a kind of calm was built. The air smelled of dust, of minerals, of damp stone. This was relaxation not of the body in rest, but of the mind in focus, steady and unbroken, a soft, timeless trance. Many such paintings were layered, meaning one person's careful mark joined another centuries later, as if the act of painting itself mattered more than the final image. Scientists studying these pigments find evidence of grinding stones and hollow bones used as primitive blowpipes, slow, meticulous tools that required patience. The motion of grinding minerals, mixing them with fat or water, and applying them again and again could be as repetitive as weaving or carving. It offered a quiet rhythm for the hands and the mind, and thus, it brought a kind of prehistoric calm. Now, we may drift into the vastness of the night sky. Stargazing, before 3000 BC, required no equipment, no telescopes, only the eyes lifted upwards, and a willingness to be still. The sky stretched wide and dark, scattered with lights that neither hurried nor faltered. Patterns slowly emerged, constellations, we call them now, but back then they were companions, markers, silent guides. To gaze for long hours was not an effort. It was rest itself. No one could rush the stars. They moved in their own unyielding rhythm, and so those who looked upon them learned to slow down too. Perhaps they found shapes of animals, or spirits, or hunters frozen forever in the sky. Perhaps they saw only small dots, pinpricks of light. Either way, the act of looking upward required stillness, patience, and the gentle release of thought. It was the very opposite of urgency. Just quiet. And wonder that asked nothing in return. What anthropologists know is that star patterns were also used for navigation and for predicting seasons, but these functions did not diminish their calming effect. To learn the slow movement of the stars, one had to sit for long hours, watching a single point inch across the horizon. This demanded not tension, but surrender. Eyes grew heavy, thoughts blurred into the dark, and breathing slowed to match the sky's own vast quietness. It was relaxation through immensity, through surrendering to something so constant that worry had no place in it. Let us rest for a moment with those who rested in nature. Before soft beds or couches, the ground itself was enough. Grass, if they could find it. The hollow of a tree, if the wind grew too strong. The cool embrace of a cave when the sun was harsh. To lie down in such places was not a luxury but a necessity. And yet, it carried with it a slow comfort. Imagine closing your eyes, hearing nothing but leaves brushing against one another, the occasional chirp of an insect, the distant trickle of water. These were not interruptions, but reminders that life carried on around you, quietly, rhythmically, unchanging. Resting in nature meant blending with it. The body sinking into the earth holding the body in return. No one worried about schedules, or messages, or unfinished tasks. There was only the moment, stretched long and soft, until sleep arrived without notice. In many ways, this closeness to the natural ground regulated body rhythms. Modern studies show that lying on cool soil or stone lowers the body's temperature gradually, encouraging drowsiness. The scent of plants, whether faint wildflowers, pine, or simple grass, created subtle sensory cues, telling the body it was safe to stop. Even the rhythm of day and night, with its natural rise and fall of light, guided sleep gently. What our ancestors found was not luxury, but inevitability. To rest in nature was to return to balance with it, and in that balance, calm was unavoidable. Softly, we begin with the simplest lullaby the world ever offered, the ambient chorus of wind over grass, water over stone, and distant animal voices that filled the long nights before any person kept a clock. In very old times, long before writing, long before cities, long before 3000 BC, human ears lived inside a continuous, changing soundscape made of geophony, wind, rain, river, biophony, birdsong, insect hum, herd calls, and the human voices that joined them. People noticed these sounds because noticing them meant understanding where water might lie, where prey or predators moved, and where weather might change, and that practical listening naturally doubled as a quieting practice. Imagine lying on a gentle slope, the body warm from a day's walk, the wind moving through reeds in a slow, steady rhythm, and the mind following that rhythm like a slow pendulum. This is not a romantic invention but a plausible everyday scene archaeologists and sensory scholars reconstruct when they study archaeoacoustics and the way prehistoric spaces shaped listening. The field of archaeoacoustics and related studies in sound archaeology show that ancient places and practices had predictable sound signatures, and researchers today use methods like acoustic modeling and careful site listening to understand how people oriented themselves by sound and how sound could foreground ritual, memory, or calm. In practical terms, sitting beside a stream or in a hollow where echoes softened voices meant fewer surprises, quieter breathing, and the soft, shared social rhythms of speech that are easier to follow when background noise is familiar, oral storytelling, the repetition of names, and communal humming or calling all fit into that same, slow pattern and likely help settle heart rates and thought. Modern reviews of the health and psychological effects of natural sounds support the idea that water, birdsong, and other nature sounds reduce stress markers and promote restorative attention, which makes the conjecture that prehistoric listening had a calming function not just poetic but consistent with measurable human responses to nature sounds today. If we take this little, calm chain of ideas, that people then lived inside listenable soundscapes, that those soundscapes encouraged stillness and communal attention, and that listening itself became a form of rest, we have a gentle and evidence-aligned sense of one of the oldest ways to be soothed, by simply allowing the world's slow noises to hold the ear and the breath. In a hush of wood and shell, we turn next to a pastime that invited very small, measured excitements and therefore much larger comforts, board play in ancient Mesopotamia, where the royal game of yore is among the most famous early examples. The archaeological boards unearthed at Ur and dated by careful stratigraphy to roughly 2600 to 2400 BCE show inlay work of shell, lapis, and stone and were found in the royal cemetery context, though later finds reveal the game traveled widely across social levels and regions. Instead of thinking of it as a novelty, imagine it as a slow, repeating household ritual, two people, a board, small pieces, and the soft, clicking sound of counters moving across inlaid squares. Centuries later, a clay tablet preserved rules or commentary about a related 20-square game, and in the 20th century Irving Finkel of the British Museum used that tablet's words and board photographs to reconstruct a playable rule set. His reconstruction suggests rosette squares that grant an extra throw in momentary safety, and these small, rule-governed pauses are precisely what made the game calming for participants who enjoyed predictability with a whisper of chance. The royal game of yore combined modest strategy, counting, and the tactile pleasure of arranging game pieces, and it seems to have been used both as ordinary entertainment and as a kind of social glue. Players might talk, remember family details, or invoke friendly omens as they played, allowing the slow movement of pieces to pace conversation and breathing. Scholars also note that the game could acquire spiritual overtones, with some inscriptions linking certain outcomes to fortune-telling phrases. Even then, the play itself remained steady and reassuring, not breathless or urgent. So, in the quiet after a day of work or in the cool of evening, the simple, regulated motion of a board game round would have been a gentle coaxing into stillness, counting, moving, waiting, and repeating until minds softened like warm wax. Beside clay and counters we may imagine the slow, domestic ritual of brewing and drinking early beer in Mesopotamia, a practice with deep archaeological traces and a very long history of being part of everyday calm. Chemical analyses of pottery and residues from sites in the Zagros and Mesopotamian region, among them finds reported from places like Godon Tepe, have revealed compounds interpreted by specialists as byproducts of cereal fermentation or beerstone, and these traces are dated to the mid-4th millennium BCE or earlier. Such results give us solid reason to say that some kinds of fermented cereal beverages were known and used well before 3000 BCE. Literary and material culture then preserved brewing as both a household skill and a social habit. Clay tablets in later Sumerian literature celebrate the goddess Ninkasi, and ritual hymns and lists of ingredients attest to the cultural centrality of brewed grain drinks, even while scholars remind us that ancient descriptions do not always map neatly to modern brewing techniques. Brewing likely involved predictable, repetitive tasks, malting grains, grinding, mixing with water, fermenting in jars, and those slow, sensorial labors could themselves be calming, like rhythmic folding or kneading. Drinking from shared cups in the evening brought a soft conviviality. Beer in many early societies functioned as a nutritional staple, a safe liquid, because fermentation reduced pathogens, and a low-key social lubricant in small, regular amounts. That archaeological chemistry, combined with textual evidence and careful anthropological interpretation, gives us a grounded picture. Brewing and drinking were not merely boisterous festivals but frequently ordinary, measured routines that eased the day's edges. Near the great river, a different sort of slow cooling opens up, people entering the water for ease, exercise, and quiet pleasure along the Nile and in nearby watery places. Images and reliefs from Egypt, along with later textual references and archaeological finds of bathing and pool installations at elite houses and tomb scenes, indicate that interaction with the Nile and with constructed pools included more than pragmatic bathing. It could include leisurely wading, swimming, and water games, especially among the elite who had gardens and private pools, and in pictorial scenes where rowing, bathing, and aquatic sport appear as elements of daily life and festival imagery. There are also much older rock painting panels in the broader Saharan and Nile margin landscapes, such as the so-called Cave of Swimmers in the Western Desert, that depict figures in postures that modern viewers read as swimming or floating, and whether those images are literal or symbolic they attest to a deep and long human awareness of bodies moving in water as part of life and ritual. Egyptological scholars caution us, correctly, not to assume uniform practices across time and class. The presence of swimmer figurines, pools in elite estates, and pictorial scenes together suggest that swimming and water play were known and valued, though the extent to which ordinary riverbank users swam for leisure at all times is debated. Still, imagining a slow afternoon by the Nile, feet in the cool current, kids paddling in shallow eddies, perhaps a gentle contest of who can glide the farthest, gives a very plausible, calming portrait of how water itself worked as a communal, restorative presence in ancient daily life. Softly, a single plucked string becomes an evening's companion, the way a small, repeated sound can make the room feel like a slow, breathing thing. In a courtyard of mud brick or beneath the low lintel of a painted tomb, musicians set their harps where light and shadow met, and listeners tilted their heads to catch each measured vibration. Archaeology and museum collections tell us that Egyptian harps were made in a few distinct shapes, arched or bow harps with a curved neck and a hollowed soundbox, and larger, more elaborate examples richly inlaid and sometimes carried or set upon stands. These instruments are visible in tomb paintings and in surviving fragments from contexts that span the Old Kingdom and later dynasties. Their placement in banquet scenes and funerary contexts suggests they moved between domestic amusement and ritual settings without much fuss. The sound those instruments produced was not loud and brash but intimate, strings plucked singly or in gentle pairs that supported a singer's melody or provided a steady, pulsing backdrop for speech. Imagining this sound is an invitation to slow the breath, each pluck a small event, spaced apart by counting or memory. Professional musicians, male and female, sometimes appear in reliefs and wall scenes, a quiet cohort who sat cross-legged and accompanied dancers or hymn singers. Sometimes, as in the famous banquet scenes, a blind harpist is shown whose attentive posture suggests listening as well as playing. Like the crackle of a hearth, the harp's rhythm could anchor communal life. It measured time without insisting on it, it kept hearts from racing and voices from breaking into hurriedness. On an evening when the Nile air cooled, a small household gathering could become softened by a few repeated progressions of notes, and the members of that household would find in the music a predictable framework for conversation, for remembering, and for easing the body toward rest. The archaeological record supports this subtle portrait. Intact harps, model harps placed in tombs, and painted musical ensembles all testify to the instrument's role in both celebration and mourning. Scholars reconstruct instrument shapes and contexts from those museum objects and from the paintings that placed musicians in rooms where guests relaxed. Even when harps appeared in temple rituals, their presence was often to accompany chant or to create a continuous, non-hurried sound that allowed participants to focus on words and gestures rather than on dramatic surprise. So, in a very real sense, listening to harp music in ancient Egypt was a practice of containment and of gentle repetition, a small sonic ritual that buffered the day's edges and allowed people to transition, slowly and agreeably, from attention to repose. To imagine it is to let the note fall and lengthen, then fall again, like a feather settling twice before stillness returns, and to let the listener breathe a little deeper as the world becomes, for a moment, simply composed of soft strings and patient night. This was ordinary, comforting, and unhurried company then. In the hush of an alabaster room or on the sun-warmed terrace, the slow ritual of anointing with scented oil could feel like a small, calming liturgy. Ancient Egyptians used perfumed unguents and scented oils across daily life and in the pathways of ritual, and these substances appear frequently in tomb inventories, temple records, and medical papyri. Their recorded presence indicates both wide use and careful production. Archaeologists and textile analysts find residues of oil and plant compounds in pottery and on cosmetic palettes, while textual recipes from later periods catalog blends of resins, flowers, and heated fats, which were mixed to carry fragrance where pure volatile distillates were not yet the norm. Balanose oil, pressed from the seeds of a desert tree, is one documented fixed oil used as a bland, stable carrier. It would absorb and retain the volatile notes of incense and aromatic resins such as myrrh and frankincense, so the perfume could be applied to skin without evaporating too quickly. Painters and masons, scribes and priests would all sometimes be anointed, and in many scenes a narrow, repeated motion of rubbing and massaging is implied, hands pressing oil into limbs, wiping a face, smoothing hair, motions that are slow and methodical, soothing in themselves. Where later texts provide formulas, the making of a perfume often required grinding and heating, steeping flowers or resins in fat or oil, and straining repeatedly. The process asked for patience and repetition like slow crafts that steady hands and mind. Some aromatic plants and flowers, lotus among them, appear repeatedly in Egyptian iconography and are associated with rest, rebirth, and the cooling of fevered states. Soaked flower parts and infused oils may have been used to scent baths or to enliven a cup of wine, and while particular claims about inebriating lotus baths remain debated, the sensory effect would have been unmistakably soothing. Experimental archaeology and chemical residue work show that many aromatic practices were practical as well as pleasant. Perfumed unguents helped protect skin in dry climates, and the handling of materials created calming, repetitive tasks. An additional archaeological curiosity, the so-called head cone seen in many reliefs, seems to represent a solid perfume placed atop a wig that would slowly melt with body heat, releasing scent across the evening, an elegantly domestic way to continue fragrance without open flame or fuss, and an image of slow scenting that fits our desire for calm. Taken together, the archaeological traces and the textual echoes sketch a sober, evidence-based picture. Scented oils in Egypt around the middle of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE were produced, traded, and used with care for personal grooming, ritual anointing, and the slow comfort of touch and scent. If we imagine the scene, we hear the soft scrape of a mortar, the measured pour of oil into a jar, and the gentle, circular motion of fingers pressing a warm unguent, each action a small surrender to routine, and each scent a quiet permission to breathe more slowly. Very gentle. Across mountains and river valleys, the idea of steeping a leaf to make a quiet broth invites a company of small, calming gestures, boiling water, a patient hand, a cup warmed between fingers. Although later poets and legends imagine tea as an ancient discovery, sometimes ascribed to mythic figures who lived many centuries before recorded history, the earliest unambiguous physical traces we have come from tomb contexts of the Han Dynasty, where charred and chemically identified leaf remains were recovered and analyzed, placing demonstrable tea use at around the 2nd century BCE rather than 2,000 years earlier. This distinction matters for accuracy but not for imagining the effect. A simple, warm infusion is inherently a mild ritual, and whether it began in legend or in a Han court, the gestures are similar and reassuring. In the Han contexts, samples recovered in imperial tombs and other sites have been identified by modern techniques such as mass spectrometry, and commentators note that tea in these places could have been used as medicine, as food, and as a valued beverage. Sometimes leaves were baked, pounded into cakes, stored, and traded, and the preparation often involved boiling or pounding rather than the delicate steeping we imagine today. Textual evidence, however, weaves a more ambiguous story. Older lexical items like tu appear in classical texts and might refer to bitter plants that include early forms of tea or other bitter vegetables. Such linguistic traces are suggestive but not conclusive. Still, imagining a small, southern courtyard or a mountain grove where a pot is warmed over low heat offers a clear scene: someone washing leaves, setting a kettle to hum, and pouring a small taste for a friend. These domestic acts define tea as a social and calming practice because they distribute attention slowly and invite conversation without hurry. In imperial households and among literati, the act of preparing tea was also a tactile meditation, measuring, rinsing, beating, and pouring in set sequences that prompt a slow rhythm for hands and breath. The repetitive motions, the warmth of the cup, and the soft, slightly bitter aroma all encourage a shift from active thought to gentle presence. Archaeobotanical work and careful chemical analyses give us the chronological modesty to say that tea as we can reliably identify it appears clearly in Han contexts, yet the long arc of Chinese culture soon turned that drink into a deliberate ritual of hospitality and quiet reflection in subsequent centuries, including formalized tea cultures and later dynasties. So, even if a listing labeled this practice as ancient China, circa 2000 BCE would be generous to oral memory rather than to physical proof, the slower and more accurate narrative still offers the same comforting image: a small cup offered across a small table, a steam-worn exchange that steadies the hand and softens the day. Some leaves were processed into cakes for storage and trade. The ritual of breaking and rinsing such a cake before brewing is a tactile step that invites patient focus. Very quiet. Imagine instead the gentle scrape of an implement on bone or bronze, a movement that requires attention, a steady wrist, and a slow acceptance of each mark's permanence. In the late 2nd millennium BCE, the forms we now call oracle bone inscriptions were incised into turtle plastrons and ox scapulae during the Shang period. These were not casual doodles but carefully executed characters used in divination records, each incision deliberate and legible to the trained eye. Archaeologists and historians observe that the maturity of those scripts implies a long period of development, which means writing was already an established craft when the knives met the bone. To make a mark in that era required a focused hand, setting the implement, carving the line, and occasionally burning or preparing the bone in a ritual sequence that connected textual work to ceremony. The act of inscribing therefore joined the cognitive practice of recording with the bodily discipline of measured motion, and it is easy to imagine that slow, repetitive carving could quiet a mind in the same way that later brush strokes would do for calligraphers. Bronze inscriptions carried the same temper. When characters were cast or incised onto ritual vessels, the artisan laid out forms and repeated them carefully across metal, producing the calm regularity that comes from repetition and from the small triumphs of forming a single, correct stroke. While the fully developed art of brush calligraphy, where the brush responds to pressure and ink yields to the hand's exactness, becomes prominent in surviving records much later, the earlier practices of carving and casting provided the visual and procedural grammar from which later, meditative brushwork would grow. Studying the archaeological corpus shows that the physical constraints of material, hard bone, bronze surfaces, or soft clay, structured the maker's movements and encouraged measured, deliberate hands, because a mistaken line could not easily be erased. Those constraints produced a slow discipline: the carver measured, the caster prepared, the ritual scribe rehearsed forms, and the repetition of characters across objects participated in a larger cultural rhythm of record-keeping, memory, and ceremonial order. For people engaged in these acts, the work's tempo moved at the pace of the tools and materials, and the result was often a focused, restorative attention rather than frantic scribbling. The mind narrowed to the mark and the mark became a small event in an otherwise noisy world. Because later literati and monks explicitly turned writing into an aesthetic and contemplative practice, scholars trace a continuous arc from those early inscribed forms through bronze engravings and onto brush calligraphy, seeing in the earliest examples the seeds of what would become a central meditative art in East Asia. So the idea of calligraphy as a calming, almost ritualized activity is not a new imposition but a gradual cultural discovery, slow hands, deliberate marks, patient repetition, and the soft satisfaction of a character well made, an ancient way to let thought condense into a single, careful line of ink or incised stroke. Soft and ancient. And now, in a soft, sideways step into a very old practice, imagine bodies arranged with the patient care of someone folding linen, slow, deliberate, and attentive, because what we call yoga has its most reliable echoes in the long Vedic horizon of the 2nd millennium BC, where words and gestures that would later be braided into fuller systems first begin to appear. Scholars who study the history of yoga trace a lineage that is complicated, generous, and cautious. The Sanskrit root yuj, meaning to yoke or to bind, appears in early Vedic literature, and suggests a concern with joining breath, mind, and action long before any formal manual was written, and archaeologists and historians gently note that possible proto-yogic images, such as the famous seated figure on the Indus Valley Pashupati seal, invite speculation but do not constitute a neatly documented lineage on their own, because iconography can be read in many careful ways. What we can say with calm confidence is that by roughly the time the Vedic texts circulated, around 1500 BCE and on, people were already describing practices of posture, breath, and focused attention in ways that would later be systematized, and those practices functioned in daily life as much as in ritual life, helping to steady the heart after travel, to center attention before offering, or to make sitting through a long ceremony less restless. The archaeological and textual record asks us to be patient with chronology. Classical compilations of yoga philosophy such as the Yoga Sutras belong far later, and physical systems like Hatha Yoga crystallize still later, but their components, controlled breathing, seated stability, and emphasis on posture as a means to steadiness, have antecedents in earlier traditions and in the ordinary bodily techniques of ascetics and ritual specialists. If you imagine a quiet courtyard or a shelter by a river, the simple motions we would call stretching today were not exercises for spectacle but adaptations of daily living that, when repeated with breath and attention, made the mind calm and the body ready for sleep. To practice them was to give the nervous system a predictable script, and predictability is itself a kind of comfort. Think of the slow repetition of a posture, the long inhalation held like a soft secret, the measured exhalation that releases small tensions. This is both ancient and immediate in effect. Scholars who write on the subject recommend careful phrasing when linking specific later doctrines to these early traces, yet they concur that the human inclination to steady the breath and orient the body is very old, and that those inclinations settled into recognizable practices across time. Hold that image, a palm pressed to the knee, a slow breath, the world dimming to the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, and let the fact that humans found in these simple, methodical gestures a route to calm be its own quiet consolation. In a gentle turn of the page, we find meditation braided into the very texture of ancient contemplative life, a practice that appears first as attentive stillness in Vedic ritual and then slowly unfolds into the more formal techniques later described in the Upanishads and other texts. Careful scholars point to the Vedic corpus as containing early references to inward attention and dhyana-like states, renderings of a mind that withdraws from busy perception, which is why many historians date the roots of meditative practice to the 2nd millennium BC while conserving nuance about terminology and method. To sit in a small hollow, to focus on a single sound or breath, to allow the mind to pool like oil in a shallow bowl, these are practical instructions as well as spiritual ones, and archaeological sensibilities about daily life support the idea that quiet, reflective practices were woven into household and in ritual calendars because they made long nights and long vigils bearable. Textual scholars remind us that the classical Upanishads, composed centuries later, formalize many of these concerns, teaching about inner light, breath control, and the stilling of thought, but they are the crystallization of many lived precedents, not the first whisper. Ethnographers and contemporary surveys of meditative practices also help us understand the probable shape of early techniques: attention to breath, repetitive chanting or silent counting, and postural steadiness recur in living traditions worldwide and have physiological correlates that reduce arousal and promote rest. If you picture someone rising before dawn to chant, then settling into a measured silence while the world dims into river mist and animal calls, you may also imagine how that silence, repeated across weeks and seasons, becomes a habit that soothes more than it excites. The breath becomes a metronome, and the stillness a soft blanket. Modern research into meditation's effects on stress markers and attention lends a quiet empirical echo to this ancient picture, validating the intuitive sense that slowing attention and aligning breath are calming, restorative acts. So when we say that meditation in ancient India finds traces as early as the Vedic age and gains textual elaboration in the Upanishads, we are gently acknowledging both archaeological modesty and the comforting continuity of human practice. Humans learned, in many different ways, to make the mind gentle by teaching it how not to hurry. A soft pivot toward the Mediterranean brings us to entertainments that were at once public and quietly absorbing. In the 8th century BCE and the centuries that followed, Greeks listened to long epic recitations and participated in communal rituals that were the ancestors of stage drama as we later recognize it, and although formal, architecturally defined theaters and competitive dramatic festivals belong a few centuries later, the earlier habit of gathering to hear a single voice or chorus recount grand stories provided a slow, shared focus that soothed listeners in its predictability. Imagine a rhapsode or bard speaking in measured hexameter beneath a low sky, the words of the Iliad or Odyssey unfurling in long, repetitive cadences that the audience could anticipate and follow. Historians and classicists place Homeric composition and performance in the archaic horizon, often dated to around the 8th century BCE, and emphasize that these oral performances functioned socially as much as artistically, giving people a ritualized occasion for slowing down and listening, and for mutual recognition through shared narratives. As cities later developed larger, stone-built theaters and the Great Dionysia crystallized into a civic festival in archaic and classical Athens, with formal dramatic competitions established in the 6th century BCE and later, audiences learned to settle into a new, still more public rhythm. Rows of spectators, a circular orchestra, and a chorus measured movements created a comfortable framework for attention, with tragedy and comedy unfolding at a pace that encouraged reflective emotion rather than hurried thrills. The archaeological and literary records, inscriptions, vase paintings, and civic regulations show that theater was at once ritual, education, and pleasure, and that attending a play could be a communal way to digest the day's cares, to laugh lightly, or to feel softly lamented in company. So whether one imagines the hush of an earlier bard's recitation or the more formal spectacle of a later dramatist, the core experience is similar, a group learning to breathe in time with words, to let narrative shape the evening, and to allow the body to relax as attention narrows and the heart slows in the unhurried company of story. In a gentle shift of focus, picture hilltops and sanctuaries filling with people's slow footsteps, because the first recorded Olympic festival, traditionally dated to 776 BCE, offered a very particular form of spectator rest, not restless cheering, but a sequence of measured events that communities watched together, learned by repetition, and used to mark time and identity. The earliest games consisted of a single footrace, the stade, and the list of early victors, transmitted through later classical compilers, begins in 776 BCE. That date functions in Greek chronology as a stable anchor and was used by ancient chronographers to reckon historical intervals. Spectator life at Olympia involved travel, ritual, and long, social pauses. Attendees arrived, attended sacrifices and processions, watched contests that had straightforward outcomes, and then lingered in the shadow of temples and treasuries to share food and stories, making the event as much a civic calm as a competitive display. Archaeology at Olympia reveals sanctuaries, altars, and spaces for assembly that structured how people moved through the festival, and literary witnesses emphasize that sporting festivals across Greece combined sacred rites with regulated competition, producing a rhythm that was communal and predictable, ideal conditions for the mind to relax. Over generations, The games accrued more events and pageantry, but the early pattern, simple contests, clear rules, and a social atmosphere that encouraged lingering and conversation, remained, and many who attended did so to experience the festival's cadence, a steady procession of contests, communal feasting, and quiet reflection beneath olive trees. In short, for ancient spectators the games were not constant adrenaline, they were a long, shared pause in the year's work, a ceremony that allowed people to be together and to let the world's care recede, if only for a season. And now, with a soft sidestep into public life, picture the graying columns of the agora where conversation settled into grooves, because the habit of debating, teaching, and simply talking in public places was itself a kind of leisure that invited slow thought rather than urgent contention. The Athenian agora, an open, multifunctional meeting ground, hosted merchants, magistrates, storytellers, and those who came to sit and listen, and by the 6th century BCE the new kinds of inquiry practiced by early philosophers found a congenial, unhurried habitat there. The pre-Socratic thinkers, active in the 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, posed questions about nature and the cosmos that were pursued in measured talk and in public exchanges rather than in isolated bursts of polemic. The symposium, another central institution of Greek leisure, offered a different but complementary space. Reclining aristocrats shared wine, music, and conversation in ritualized sequences, and these sessions could be remarkably calm and reflective, inviting stories, ethical questions, and the slow exchange of ideas that bound friendships. Plato's later depictions of symposia show how such evening gatherings functioned as conversational routines that encouraged measured speech. Historical and archaeological records show that these public spaces and events were framed by norms, formal roles, expected behaviors, and repetitive sequences, that made discourse predictable and therefore soothing. A person could enter the agora or a symposium knowing the rough form the evening would take, and predictability, again, is a quiet refuge. Over time these public habits nurtured intellectual life, shopside debates, roadside lectures, and the reputations of teachers who taught in the open air, and the cultural effect was to create ordinary occasions for slow, sustained thinking. So when you imagine a sun-warmed stone bench and the low murmur of citizens exchanging hypotheses about the stars or ethics, you are imagining one of antiquity's gentlest forms of leisure, talk measured like breath, curiosity guided by civility, and a communal patience that let ideas unfold at their own unhurried pace. In a hush of warmed stone and slow, steady steam, imagine early Roman bathing not as a single, sudden invention but as a series of small, domestic habits that gradually became public life's soft machinery. In the archaic and early Republican centuries people washed in household basins, river shallows, or simple balcony, the smaller private or neighborhood baths, and only later did the monumental thermae, those great communal complexes with a measured procession of hot and cold rooms, become the civic norm we picture now. Archaeology and careful reading of ancient authors remind us to be precise. The baths of Agrippa in the Campus Martius, often credited as Rome's first large public complex, were associated with Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa and dated to the late 1st century BCE, around 25 to 19 BCE in surviving accounts, which shows that the idea of an imperial-scale bathhouse is a product of a long, patient evolution rather than of a single moment. Nonetheless, simpler public bathing had earlier predecessors and influences from Greek and Etruscan practices, so bathing as a social habit stretches back before the empire's grand architecture. If you picture the ritual, the warm tepidarium that lulls a breath, the hotter caldarium that loosens small tensions, the bracing frigidarium that asks the body to notice the present, you are imagining a choreography designed to slow people down, enter, sit, sweat, cool, rub, chat, and rest. Workers applied oils and sometimes used a strigil to scrape skin in a steady motion that is tactile and repetitive. Attendants and friends exchanged small talk while bodies relaxed beneath vaults, mosaics, and quiet pools, and libraries or gardens attached to some complexes turned a bath day into a slow circuit of senses. The hypocaust heating system, when present in later public baths, moved warmth under floors in an unhurried convection that made rooms feel like a slowly turning gear warming a sleeping machine. Water, steam, and marble together created a sensory architecture that soothed. Scholars studying remains and texts emphasize that bathing mixed hygiene with social life, exercise, and repose, and that the Roman baths program, the sequence of heated to cooled spaces, the social seating, the gentle services, worked like a long, slow exhale for city life. In that mild, habitual exhale, the body's pace descended toward rest, and the mind, attending to predictable ritual, let itself unlace small knots of worry. In a soft sideways shift, we consider the arena of spectacle where many came to sit together, watch, and let attention be carried by ritual contest. Gladiatorial games began as funerary munera in central Italy and regions influenced by Etruscan and Campanian rites, and the first securely recorded instance in Roman literature is placed in 264 BCE when games were held at a funeral in Rome, showing the practice's early, somber social roots before it grew into a broader public institution. Those early combats, 3 pairs according to the ancient annalists, were not yet the huge state spectacles of later centuries, but they introduced a public ritual that combined remembrance, social display, and a regulated sequence of events that spectators could learn and anticipate. Over time the entertainments expanded, more events, more pageantry, purpose-built amphitheaters, but the spectator's slow ritual remained: arrive, find a place in an ordered seating scheme, watch a sequence of contests in which rules, heralds, and pauses mark transitions, and then leave, often lingering to talk under the sun. The amphitheater's architecture, whether a wooden temporary ring or the later stone Colosseum, structured how sound traveled, how processions paced themselves, and how the crowd's breathing synchronized with the day's progress. Historians remind us that sponsors of games provided gestures of civic largesse and that for many attendees the event was a social calendar marker more than constant adrenaline. Even the rituals that permitted lethal outcomes were embedded in formal language and law, and spectators learned the signs of pause, mercy, and resolution as part of the spectacle's grammar. In that steady grammar of announcement, combat, pause, and procession, audiences found a predictable ritual rhythm that, paradoxically, made communal life's intensity feel studyably distant, an ordered pastime that let minds rest into shared attention, like watching slow shadows cross a wall of softly worn stone. In the green geometry of a villa's interior garden, imagine a deliberate architecture of plants and paths designed to be soft on the senses and slow on the thinking mind. Roman villa gardens, Horti and peristyle courts, developed into cultivated refuges by the late Republic and early Imperial ages, with sophistication increasing from around the 2nd century BCE onward, when elites began to design enclosed gardens filled with box hedges, fruit trees, shade, water features, and sculpted nooks meant for meditation and gentle conversation. These gardens were not simply produce patches, they combined utility, kitchen herbs, fruit, and ornament flowers, fountains, statues, so that a stroll from a dining room into a shaded walk felt like stepping into a different, quieter program of the day. The layout often followed a measured plan, colonnaded peristyles framing central pools, shaded alleys of plane and olive trees, and small enclosures where herbs like mint and savory grew alongside roses and laurels, plants selected both for scent and for symbolic calm. Gardeners cultivated hedges with repetitive clipping, mixed soil with compost in patient rotations, and tended water features that kept a soft, constant sound, water over stone being one of those ancient, gentle noises that the body recognizes as safe. Owners or guests would read, converse, or nap among these plantings. Poets and writers later described such horti as places of retreat from urban clamor, and archaeobotanical finds and villa plans corroborate a long-standing practice of creating deliberate, restful green rooms inside larger estates. The sensory choreography, dappled light, soft fragrances, the slow rustle of clipped leaves, paced the day to a human tempo, leisurely steps, measured breaths, and the mind easing into focus or release. In such gardens the act of cultivation itself was calming, planting, pruning, and watering are rhythmic crafts that steady hands and steady hearts, and in tending green matter humans made a small, living machinery of solace that turned slowly, season after season. In the cool hush beneath stone and vaulted timber, church music unfolded in a long, unadorned line of single melodic voice, what later generations label Gregorian chant, whose name honors Pope Gregory I, 590–604, in tradition, though scholars remind us that the musical forms developed across centuries and that the fuller codification of Western plain chant took shape mainly in the Carolingian reforms of the 9th century and in the centuries around them. Still, the essential character of plain chant, monophonic, unaccompanied melodic chanting of liturgical texts, was the Church's steady sonic cloak for prayer and rest. When monks and clerics intoned psalms and hymns in unison, the voice's long, sustained lines and the absence of harmonic distraction encouraged breathing to lengthen and thought to soften. One note bled into another with slow cadences, and the ritual schedule of the hours, matins, lauds, vespers, provided repeated intervals of this soft music throughout the day. The ritual language and melodic modes shaped expectations. Listeners came to know the contour of a hymn and to let it carry attention away from pressing concerns toward a communal, measured focus. Notation systems such as neumes arrived later to support memory and uniformity, so early chant relied on oral transmission and familiar melodies that congregations could follow without sharp surprises. In practice, the chant's predictability, plainness, and liturgical embedding made it a reliable, calming presence in monastic and parish life. Scholars note that Carolingian standardization and later medieval practice produced a wide repertoire of chant types, antiphons, responsories, graduals, but the consistent effect remained, a sustained, communal singing that regulated breathing and drew the heart into the slow time of prayer, like feathers drifting down inside a quiet hall. In a quiet turn toward cloistered life, the monasteries made silence and attentive reading into restorative crafts, and by the 6th century the rule of Saint Benedict organized monastic time into a rhythm of prayer, work, and reading that included Lectio Divina, a slow, meditative reading of Scripture, and communal offices that paced the day in measured segments. Earlier Christian ascetics in Egypt and the Syrian deserts had already practiced forms of inward recollection and contemplative silence centuries before Benedict, and those desert practices fed into the Western monastic imagination. Benedict's rule, written in the early 6th century, then formalized a balance of manual labor, vocal prayer, and contemplative reading that allowed the mind to settle through repetition and routine. Lectio Divina, though named and elaborated more clearly in later centuries, embodies a simple sequence: read a passage slowly, meditate on a phrase, pray in response, and rest in quiet contemplation, and its slow tempo is explicitly designed to reduce distraction and invite inner stillness. The monastic day's scaffolding, regular offices, communal meals, assigned labor, and set times for private reading, functions like a soft mechanism of habit. When tasks and prayers come at known intervals, the nervous system need not stay vigilantly alert, and attention can descend into calmer registers. Archaeological remains of cloisters and the textual record of rules and psalmody show communities intentionally creating environments for this slow attention: stone-walled gardens where a brother might walk and breathe between offices, scriptoriums where copying required a slow, careful hand, and oratories where chant and silence alternated in gentle cadence. The result, for those inside the cloister, was a life shaped by predictability and ritual that supported contemplative practice, a culture of measured actions that invited the mind to contract into a single point of focus and then to release into restful stillness, like a small gear that, when turned slightly and steadily, makes the whole machine breathe with ease. In a soft drift through the early medieval world, one might imagine a noble courtyard or windswept hilltop where falcons rest lightly on gloved hands, their talons curled in delicate, patient grip. Falconry, practiced from roughly the 8th century CE onward among European and Middle Eastern aristocracy, was not merely a sport but a careful, methodical companionship between human and bird. Historical records, manuscripts, and illuminated illustrations depict the process of training a hawk or falcon with attention to diet, perching habits, and gentle correction, the falconer feeds the bird, rewards calm behavior, and teaches it to return after a flight. Birds were carefully selected for size, temperament, and flight patterns, and manuals such as the early 12th century treatise The Book of St. Albans codified much of what had already evolved through centuries of practice, showing us that falconry was a long-standing tradition of attentive, patient interaction. The slow rhythm of carrying, releasing, observing, and recalling the bird formed a meditative cycle, the falcon's quiet watch, the controlled pace of flight, and the gradual learning process for both human and bird created an environment in which time felt extended, attention narrowed, and bodily tension eased. Aristocrats could walk for hours across fields, observing the glide and stoop, while the bird practiced its instinctual behaviors under gentle supervision. The equipment itself, hoods, jesses, and gloves, added layers of ritualized care. Each piece was adjusted, checked, and maintained, forming a repeated sequence that grounded the falconer in mindful, unhurried attention. In this slow choreography of care, flight, and retrieval, the nobility experienced relaxation in the form of patience, observation, and quiet companionship, rather than loud excitement. The sensory experience, soft feather textures, subtle sounds of wings, and the occasional distant cry of quarry, enveloped the practitioner in calm awareness. The combination of tactile handling, deliberate feeding, and the bird's rhythmic patterns of takeoff and return created a daily practice that was as much about inner stillness as about outdoor exercise or hunting success, and for centuries, falconry remained a noble and contemplative leisure practice that required both patience and careful observation. In a gentle sidestep to another medieval pastime, imagine a hearth-lit hall where bards, with long tunics and soft-voiced instruments, sit before an attentive audience to recite poems and tales that weave history, myth, and moral instruction together. By the 9th century CE, storytelling by itinerant poets and musicians had become a reliable form of entertainment and relaxation in courts and villages across Europe. Manuscripts and early chronicles preserve accounts of minstrels and jongleurs traveling from court to court, offering long narrative cycles about heroes, saints, and fantastical creatures. The rhythm of speech, carefully modulated, often sung or chanted, allowed listeners to follow along without distraction, while the repetition of formulas and motifs provided a soothing predictability. In halls with stone floors and wooden benches, the bard's voice carried slowly, measured against the crackle of firewood and the soft shuffle of listeners settling into position. Often, these tales were interactive. Applause, soft laughter, and murmured responses created a slow social rhythm, reinforcing attention and the communal enjoyment of the story. Some narratives lasted hours or even days, unfolding in serial episodes that invited audiences to return, strengthening the habitual, gentle pacing of leisure. Contemporary studies of oral traditions suggest that repetitive phrasing, predictable cadences, and melodic delivery all contribute to mental relaxation, and medieval audiences, through daily experience and cultural reinforcement, learned to let these qualities slow the heartbeat and soften mental tension. Whether a tale described the heroic labors of Charlemagne, the miraculous deeds of saints, or the adventures of legendary figures, the focus was rarely on suspense for its own sake, but on the rhythmic unfolding of words, gestures, and attentive listening. The hall itself, often echoing and warmly lit, amplified the effect. The listener's mind could rest in the predictable flow of narrative, while imagination gently extended beyond walls. Bards thus created a slow temporal frame that invited both attentiveness and repose, making storytelling an essential, calming leisure activity in medieval social life, with its repeated patterns, measured pauses, and soft interplay between performer and audience. Across the quiet hum of domestic life, one can picture hands moving deliberately over wool or flax, looping, twisting, and tying fibers with patience and attention that soothe both body and mind. Knitting and weaving, common by around 1000 CE in Europe and parts of Asia, were not merely utilitarian but also meditative crafts that encouraged slow, repetitive motion and careful concentration. Archaeological finds and textile analyses from medieval settlements show that woven cloth, simple garments, and ornamental patterns were created on a range of devices, from small handheld frames to larger looms, and the work required rhythm, hand-eye coordination, and sustained attention. Written accounts, illuminated manuscripts, and household inventories note the production of textiles in both noble and ordinary households, suggesting that crafting was a widely accessible, everyday form of leisure. The act of interlacing threads and yarns, adjusting tension, and repeating basic motifs forms a quiet ritual. One watches the emerging pattern, the fabric taking shape under slow, deliberate gestures. The repetitive motions engage the hands in predictable sequences, which researchers today associate with calming effects on the mind and nervous system, much like contemporary mindfulness exercises. Soft fibers pass over fingers, loops form and release, and subtle textures create a tactile feedback that supports sustained focus. Seasonal or ceremonial variations, embroidered motifs, colored threads, or patterned weavings, add gentle variety without disrupting the rhythm, allowing the maker to remain deeply absorbed while attending to aesthetic details. Even small adjustments, counting rows or tracking patterns, contribute to the meditative pace. Within a domestic space, surrounded by soft daylight, the quiet sound of loom or needles, and the faint odor of treated fibers, a crafter could enter a mental space entirely different from the pressures of survival or social duty. The process itself becomes a form of slow, restorative attention, rhythmical, grounded, and predictable, supporting calm reflection. In a medieval household, therefore, knitting and weaving were not only means of producing garments or household textiles, but also a practical, effective method for cultivating quiet and patience in daily life, a tactile meditation that unfolded stitch by stitch, row by row, across the day. And in another layer of medieval social life, imagine the heavy tables of feasting halls, laden with bread, roasted meats, fruits, and sweetmeats, candles flickering across wooden surfaces, and the soft murmur of gathered companions. Banquets of the 11th century were occasions for communal relaxation, ritualized display, and slow social interaction. Historical records, charters, and illuminated manuscripts document elaborate meal sequences in noble households and monasteries alike. Dishes were served in stages, often preceded by ritual hand-washing, with careful attention to the order of service, seating, and table etiquette. The sequence of food, drink, and measured conversation provided structured time for reflection, enjoyment, and conversation. The pacing allowed digestion both physically and mentally. Attendees reclined or sat according to custom, passed platters with deliberate care, and participated in gentle storytelling or musical interludes while dining, creating an environment in which attentiveness and repose were mutually reinforced. Banquets were extended events, multiple courses, intervals for ceremonial toasts, and ambient music or poetry provided layers of repeated sensory cues, allowing participants to relax gradually over the course of hours. Observations of surviving manuscripts and descriptions of court life suggest that such meals were not rushed, and even in larger gatherings, social protocols created predictable rhythms that enabled calm and gentle focus. Food itself, soft bread, tender meats, and fruits, was consumed slowly, with attention to taste, aroma, and texture, supporting the body's sense of measured time. Scholars emphasize that the ritualized, structured nature of these feasts contributed to their relaxing qualities. Order, repetition, and shared attention to both sustenance and social interaction made these gatherings restorative, rather than merely indulgent. In the soft candlelight of a medieval hall, the combination of food, drink, conversation, and predictable ceremonial rhythm created an environment where both mind and body could release tension, rest into comfort, and absorb the communal pleasures of being part of a slow-moving, attentive society. Turning now to the gentle theater of local performance, one may imagine the streets and churchyards of 12th-century towns where mystery plays unfolded with deliberate slowness, combining narrative, music, and gesture in a ritualized frame. Mystery plays, often performed in cycles that narrated biblical stories from creation to the Last Judgment, emerged around the 12th century, particularly in England, France, and the Low Countries, and were closely linked to the liturgical calendar. Manuscripts, civic records, and later accounts indicate that these plays were typically enacted by guilds or local artisans, who rehearsed collectively, arranged simple scenery, and performed with measured timing for an audience gathered on the street or in a churchyard. The content, while dramatic in theme, was delivered with repetitive, ritualized gestures and speech that made it easy for viewers to follow. Dialogue, choruses, and narration unfolded predictably, allowing spectators to settle into the flow of story. The staging encouraged slow attention, movement between platforms, the rhythm of speech, and the pacing of scene changes produced a communal cadence that made the day's events comprehensible and calming. Music, singing, and occasional instrumental accompaniment provided a continuous, steady soundscape, and audience interaction, applause, quiet laughter. In a quiet corner of a dimly lit hall, imagine wooden boards laid before noble and scholarly hands, carved with squares alternating pale and dark, each carefully polished over years of gentle use. By the early 14th century, around 1300 CE, chess had become a favored pastime among the European elite, though its origins trace back centuries earlier to the Indian game chaturanga and the Persian shatranj, slowly evolving as it traveled across the Islamic world into medieval Europe. Historical records, illuminated manuscripts, and marginalia show kings, courtiers, and scholars bent over these boards, moving pieces with deliberate attention, practicing strategy, and quietly contemplating outcomes that would not arrive for hours. Each piece, king, queen, bishop, knight, rook, and pawn, carries not just tactical value but a symbolic weight, and learning to manipulate them requires measured thought, patience, and foresight. The slow unfolding of a match, with its careful plotting and repeated scenarios, provides the mind with a rhythm as steady and absorbing as a heartbeat, calming in its predictability while still engaging intellect. Manuals, some surviving from the 13th and 14th centuries, outline openings, defensive maneuvers, and common traps, giving players structured guidance and allowing even beginners to feel the gentle satisfaction of planned progress. Sitting across from another person, eyes tracing the board, fingers adjusting pieces, and considering consequences, creates an atmosphere of attentive quiet. Small gestures and soft conversation accompany long moments of reflection. Beyond the cognitive exercise, chess provides a sensory environment for calm. The smooth slide of a wooden piece, the subtle scratch of inked diagrams in reference books, the muted footsteps of onlookers or attendants, all contribute to a shared, slow experience. In that prolonged attention and repeated engagement, the mind is both occupied and soothed, weaving relaxation into the act of deliberate, thoughtful play. The game's structured patterns, familiar moves, and the soft, tactile continuity of pieces moving across squares allow players to inhabit a mental space removed from external pressures, fostering an intimate, contemplative leisure that has persisted across centuries and cultures. Turning gently toward the visual arts of the Renaissance, one can imagine a painter or draftsman at a sunlit window, brushes or styluses in hand, small movements repeated with careful patience. By the early 15th century, around 1400 CE, artists across Italy and northern Europe began to treat painting and drawing not only as vocational craft but also as a slow, meditative activity, a personal leisure that engaged both mind and body. Surfaces were prepared with precise layering, gesso on panels, smooth vellum for manuscript illumination, or fine pigments mixed with oils or tempera, requiring both technical attention and rhythmic patience. Sketchbooks, surviving manuscripts, and workshop records show apprentices and masters tracing lines repeatedly, practicing composition, and exploring forms with meticulous care. The act of observation and rendering invites a steady focus that slows thought and eases the restless mind. The process involves repeated attention to line, proportion, shadow, and perspective, a soft movement of the hand, a careful dab of pigment, a gentle blending of colors across a slowly drying surface. In doing so, the artist experiences a subtle internal rhythm, the repetition of motion, the quiet absorption in form and hue, and the gentle pacing of completion produce an environment of calm. Visual creativity becomes a quiet conversation between perception and expression, a tactile and mental engagement that encourages lingering and careful attention. Patrons and scholars note that artists often practice these skills outside formal commissions, suggesting that even when not working for display, painting and drawing functioned as an internal meditation, a leisure of quiet accomplishment. The brush or stylus in hand, the eye tracing lines, and the mind attending to composition, all create a soft loop of focus and reflection that gently occupies attention and invites a meditative state. In this domestic or studio solitude, the Renaissance artist cultivates not just beauty but calm, letting the careful, repeated motions of drawing and painting become a rhythm for the mind to rest upon. Elsewhere, in the quiet corners of a Renaissance home, imagine the soft rustle of newly printed pages as the technology of movable type, pioneered by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, began to make literature accessible to those outside clerical or aristocratic circles. Reading, once the domain of manuscript holders and scholars, gradually became a private, contemplative pastime. Early printed books, Bibles, devotional texts, poetry, and treatises, offered both narrative engagement and cognitive absorption, the physical act of turning a page, pausing over a passage, and tracing words with the finger provided a gentle rhythm that encouraged reflection and slowed the mind. Communities and private individuals increasingly cultivated reading as a quiet, structured leisure, often alone, where repetition of themes, familiar moral structures, or poetic cadences invited mental relaxation. Printers' care in producing consistent typefaces, margins, and page layouts ensured that the visual environment of reading itself was orderly and soothing. Scholars note that early book ownership and reading practices often included deliberate pacing, reading aloud or subvocalizing, pausing to consider passages, or comparing with previous texts, creating a layered and slow engagement with language. This solitary attention allowed readers to detach from social pressures or external demands, entering an internal space defined by measured thought and the soft flow of narrative. The simple physicality of handling a book, coupled with the predictability of linear progression through text, created a sensory and cognitive lull, and many contemporary observers remarked on the gentle pleasure of such quiet contemplation. In the early decades following Gutenberg, the diffusion of printed books transformed leisure, not through excitement or novelty alone, but through repeated, absorbed reading that trained attention and encouraged a slow, reflective engagement with the written word. In another chamber, one may picture a small lute or viol resting against a cushioned chair, and a musician plucking or bowing strings in a rhythm that is deliberate, soothing, and attentive. By around 1500 CE, private musical performance became a cultivated domestic leisure, with instruments such as lutes, viols, and viols accompanying slow compositions designed for contemplation, dance, or gentle accompaniment to song. Treatises and iconography from the period demonstrate that playing music at home encouraged repetition, hand-eye coordination, and steady breathing. A single note is drawn, a chord measured, a melody repeated until it achieves a soft resonance. Patrons, students, and family members engaged with music not primarily as spectacle but as personal rhythm, and the practice could be both meditative and social, with performers exchanging parts, rehearsing harmonies, or accompanying simple dances. The tactile feedback of strings, the vibration under fingertips, and the gentle sound waves produced an auditory environment that enveloped the listener and performer alike, slowing thought and providing a comforting structure. Instructional manuscripts from the period describe exercises in scales, fingering, and tuning, revealing a process of deliberate repetition designed to master skill while maintaining calm. In effect, the musician's body learned to inhabit a predictable tempo, which in turn steadied the mind. Whether performing alone in a sunlit chamber, practicing with a small family circle, or accompanying soft song, the act of producing music creates a layered rhythm of attention, movement, and auditory feedback. In this intimate setting, sound becomes a vehicle for relaxation, each measured note inviting the mind to linger, each repeated passage creating a gentle cognitive loop that mirrors the slow, comforting patterns of daily life. Through this combination of touch, hearing, and focus, Renaissance musicians discovered a personal leisure that harmonized both body and mind, cultivating attentiveness, patience, and quiet contentment in measured melodic motion. And in another gentle turn of perception, consider a strolling figure in a carefully designed garden, walking under arcades, along symmetrical alleys, and past fountains that drip in steady cadence. By around 1550 CE, European landscape gardens, particularly in Italy and later in France, were crafted to invite measured walking, contemplation, and slow appreciation of plants, sculptures, and water features. Garden plans, letters, and treatises from the period describe geometric layouts with axial paths, clipped hedges, and ornamental parterres, designed to encourage pacing, observation, and reflection. The act of walking itself, steps measured, eyes moving from detail to detail, occasional pause to listen to water or birds, creates a rhythm in which the mind naturally slows. Sculptures, fountains, and arranged trees serve as visual anchors for attention, and the repetition of pattern across space reinforces predictability, comfort, and gentle mental engagement. Garden designers and theorists emphasized not only aesthetic harmony but also the psychological effect. Spaces intended for leisure and meditation reduce mental clutter and support a soft cognitive focus. Archival drawings and contemporary accounts reveal the interplay of light, shadow, and seasonal change. The same paths and vistas, revisited over weeks or months, encourage a slow, reflective habit, turning ordinary strolls into structured moments of calm. The combination of nature, crafted design, and predictable visual rhythm produces an environment that encourages deep breathing, attentive perception, and gentle release from pressing concerns. In these Renaissance gardens, walking becomes more than exercise, it is a soft ritual of sensory engagement, reflection, and measured delight, allowing body and mind to slow, settle, and restore themselves amidst living, breathing artistry. And so, my drowsy listener, we have drifted together, through fire and stories, through hands upon stone, through stars above, grass below and much much more. These were the earliest relaxations. They were not exciting. Not even a little bit. And that is just perfect. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.